Let me begin by asking you a simple question. What happens when walls of oppression built for years to deny a people their basic humanity begin to crack? Today, that very question echoes across the shores of Gaza. After years of blockade, years of hunger, years of desperation, the first aid ships have broken through. The images of families watching supplies arrive, of children holding food, of mothers finally seeing medicine that had been denied to them. These are not just pictures. They are history being written before our very eyes. The fall of Gaza's blockade is more than just a headline. It is a profound moment in modern political history. For years, Gaza has been a place synonymous with suffering, a region where over 2 million men, women, and children lived under conditions that many international observers described as an open-air prison. To imagine life where the very basics, food, clean water, fuel, medicine, were not guaranteed, not because of natural disaster, not because of lack of human capacity, but because of a deliberate political choice, is to understand why this moment matters so deeply. The blockade was not simply a restriction of goods, it was a suffocating hand pressed down on an entire population, and today, that grip has finally loosened. Ask yourself, what happens when a people long denied begin to taste freedom again? What happens when the gates of restriction crack open and hope rushes in with it? That is what Gaza embodies today. For too long, the story of Gaza has been written by its isolation. International reports, photographs of rubble, children standing in lines for food. These images became routine, almost normalized in the global imagination. And normalization of suffering is one of the cruelest forms of violence. When the world accepts that 2 million people living under blockade is business as usual, the humanity of those people is denied. Yet this moment shatters that normalization. The blockade's fall, even if partial, even if contested, declares that what was once presented as permanent is in fact fragile. The permanence of oppression is always an illusion. Those who lived under this blockade were meant to forget what freedom looks like, but today's breakthrough reminds them, and us, that history can shift in an instant. The arrival of aid ships is not just about sacks of flour or cartons of medicine stacked on wooden pallets. No, what sailed into Gaza's waters carried something far greater: dignity. For a people stripped of choice, the act of receiving aid without the permission of their oppressor is itself a revolutionary victory. It says, we exist, we resist, and we cannot be silenced. Food nourishes the body, yes, but dignity nourishes the spirit, and Gaza is now feasting on both. Think about the symbolism of a ship breaking through a blockade. Throughout history, walls and blockades have been the tools of the powerful. Yet time and again, from Berlin to South Africa, walls fall, and when they do, the fall becomes a turning point for the world. Gaza's ships are not only carrying cargo, they are carrying the echo of those other historical moments where oppression was forced to retreat. There is also the economic reality that underpinned this blockade. By cutting Gaza off from trade, from movement, from normal economic life, the blockade attempted to engineer dependence. It was meant to suffocate not just people but potential. No factories, no exports, no thriving economy, just survival on the margins. And survival under conditions dictated by someone else's authority. Yet in every economic experiment of strangulation, there lies a fatal flaw: human ingenuity, human persistence. The fact that aid has arrived despite the blockade is evidence of a broader truth. Control through deprivation is never absolute. A people denied will always find a way to reassert life. This is why the end of the blockade, even if temporary or partial, is historic. It demonstrates the limits of power. It reveals the cracks in policies designed to dominate. And it reminds us that no matter how entrenched a system of control appears, resistance can destabilize it. To those watching around the globe, this is not just Gaza's story. It is a universal lesson: when systems of oppression are challenged persistently, with solidarity and courage, they eventually falter. What Gaza experiences today may well inspire others who live behind walls, whether literal or economic, to believe that their walls too can fall. And here lies the deeper hook. This is not simply a humanitarian moment, it is a political earthquake. It forces us to ask difficult questions: who built this blockade? Who maintained it? who profited from it, and most importantly, who now feels threatened by its collapse. Power never yields willingly. The fact that aid ships arrived means a power somewhere failed to maintain control, and that failure is precisely why Gaza's celebration matters. It is the sound of a people rising in joy against the silence imposed upon them. It is the first breath of a community long deprived of air, and once a people have breathed freedom, no blockade, no wall, no system of control can ever feel as secure again. The breakthrough of aid ships into Gaza is not merely a logistical development, it is the culmination of years of resistance, the stubborn persistence of people refusing to surrender to despair, and the result of global voices that would not let this story be buried beneath the noise of geopolitics. Too often, events like these are described in sterile terms: cargo, tonnage, supply lines. But the truth is, this moment is charged with symbolism. It is a defiant reminder that walls built on injustice cannot withstand the combined weight of persistence and solidarity. The supplies may fill empty shelves and hospital cabinets, but the greater victory is what these ships represent, that even the most entrenched systems of oppression can be pierced. Think about what it means for the people of Gaza to witness these vessels arrive. For years, their horizon was closed off by warships, their coastline policed by a blockade that cut them off not only from goods but from the wider human community. Ships were once symbols of exclusion, the embodiment of power used to enforce their isolation. But today, ships are the opposite. They are symbols of hope, breaking through where none were allowed to pass. This transformation of meaning is profound. It is a reversal of narrative, one that turns instruments of control into instruments of liberation. That is why celebrations erupted not only in the streets of Gaza, but in the hearts of those who watched from afar. And make no mistake, this was no gift handed down by those who imposed the blockade. It was pried open, wrestled from their grip through relentless effort. Local resistance inside Gaza did not wither despite years of deprivation. International activists refused to be silenced even when their voices were dismissed or criminalized. Diplomatic pressures, grassroots campaigns, protests in faraway capitals. Together they built momentum that finally breached what seemed impenetrable. The arrival of these ships proves that change does not come from appeals to power's conscience. It comes from challenging power's authority. That is a lesson that resonates far beyond Gaza. There is another dimension to this breakthrough: its psychological impact. For years, the blockade conditioned people to feel powerless. Every loaf of bread, every vial of medicine became subject to permission. That kind of dependency eats away at dignity. But when aid ships arrive without the permission of the oppressor, the psychological script changes. Dependency shifts into agency, despair shifts into empowerment. It tells every child in Gaza that their lives are not invisible, that their struggles are not forgotten, and that collective effort, though slow, though costly, can break chains. This mental shift may be as important as the physical supplies themselves, because it restores something no blockade can control: hope. Consider how history will frame this. When analysts in years to come reflect on the dynamics of the Middle East, they will not just recount battles or treaties. They will recall the day when ships carried more than aid. They carried defiance, courage, and the victory of persistence. Gaza's people will remember that it was not silence or waiting that brought change, but relentless resistance coupled with international solidarity. And others living under sanctions, sieges, and blockades will look to this moment and ask, if Gaza can break free, why not us? This is the ripple effect of symbolic victories. They inspire action beyond their immediate borders. This is why governments that supported or tolerated the blockade are uneasy tonight. They know the power of an image, a ship's hull breaking through the waves, greeted by crowds who once knew only scarcity. They know that narrative power is as dangerous as military power. If the story of Gaza transforms from one of victimhood to one of triumph, then the justification for blockades elsewhere grows weaker. The lesson is clear: oppressive systems are not invincible, they are fragile when confronted by determination and solidarity. So let us ask ourselves, what broke the blockade? Was it a shift in military balance? No. Was it an act of mercy by those in power? Absolutely not. It was the resilience of Gaza's people who never abandoned their dignity and the persistence of global movements which never allowed the world to look away. That is the true cargo carried by these aid ships, the proof that solidarity, when unrelenting, can achieve what seemed impossible. And that message, far more than the food or medicine unloaded, is what makes this moment historic. The blockade on Gaza was never only about security, no matter how many times that narrative was repeated to the international community. To frame it as a protective measure was always to mask the deeper truth, that it was a calculated political and economic strategy of control. A genuine security measure protects people without suffocating them. This blockade suffocated over 2 million people indiscriminately. It was collective punishment, designed to weaken a society from within by turning daily life into a series of impossible struggles. Ask yourself, if it were truly about security, would children be denied medical supplies? Would universities lack books, students blocked from travel, and entire industries prevented from functioning? Security was the language, but control was the reality. When we look at Gaza through this lens, the picture changes. Every checkpoint, every cargo restriction, every fishing limit was not simply about preventing weapons, but about stripping away autonomy. Autonomy in trade, autonomy in education, autonomy in healthcare, even autonomy in the simple act of fishing from one's own coastline. Each of these was chipped away under the guise of safety. What emerged was not safety for anyone, but paralysis for an entire population. And paralysis in political terms is control. If you make a people dependent on your permission to survive, then you dictate not just their material lives, but their political possibilities. That is why the blockade endured so long. It was not a shield, but a tool of domination. There is also the economic logic behind such blockades, and it is essential to uncover it. When a society is denied the ability to produce, to trade, to connect with markets beyond its borders, it is pushed into manufactured poverty. Gaza's factories once produced textiles, furniture, agricultural goods. Its skilled workers once contributed to regional economies. The blockade hollowed this out systematically. Goods were blocked, exports choked, imports strangled to a trickle. What is the effect? A population forced to rely on aid, on handouts, on charity, always uncertain, always insufficient. And when a people are reduced to this kind of dependency, the power of the oppressor grows. That dependency was never incidental, it was the point. Poverty became the mechanism of control, just as much as military patrols or naval enforcement. But here is the flaw in such strategies: people are not passive subjects to be manipulated indefinitely. The longer the blockade persisted, the more it revealed its true character, and the more it generated resistance rather than submission. Families learned to survive with creativity. Communities learn to rebuild after bombings, to improvise around shortages, to use whatever means available to assert life against suffocation. The blockade's designers imagined they could drain Gaza of political will by draining it of resources. Instead, they fed a culture of defiance, one that said survival itself is resistance. What they miscalculated is that desperation breeds not only despair but determination. And then there is the international dimension. If the blockade were truly about security, it would have been measured, temporary, and subject to transparent review. Instead, it became an indefinite structure, renewed year after year, regardless of conditions on the ground. This exposed its true purpose. The world began to see that it was not about defense, but about control, about projecting dominance over a people who refused to vanish. And once that truth crystallized, solidarity movements grew. Universities, unions, human rights organizations, even governments began to question what had long been sold as necessity. The blockade's legitimacy crumbled under scrutiny because at its core, it was not defensible. The arrival of aid ships is therefore more than a logistical breach. It is a symbolic indictment. It says to the world the blockade was never what its architects claimed. It was not about preventing weapons, it was about preventing freedom. And when ships arrive, bringing relief without permission, they expose the entire narrative as a fraud. They remind us that the most powerful justification for oppression is always dressed in the language of safety, but safety that is selective. Safety that protects one group by crushing another is not safety at all, it is domination disguised. So we return to the fundamental question: if the blockade was about control, what happens when control slips? What happens when the narrative unravels and the oppressed celebrate a victory that the powerful insisted could never come? That is where we are today, and that is why this moment matters. It is not just about breaking a wall of steel and ships. It is about breaking the myth that oppression can hide behind the language of security forever. Gaza's blockade was never about protection. It was about power. And when power is unmasked, when it is revealed for what it is, its days are always numbered. The arrival of aid ships in Gaza is not just the story of supplies being delivered. It is the story of movements across the globe that refused to give up, of voices that grew louder each time they were ignored, of communities that understood that solidarity is not symbolic, it is powerful. For years, governments, media outlets, and institutions sought to portray Gaza's blockade as unshakable, as if nothing could pierce the walls erected around it. Yet the arrival of these ships proves the opposite. Walls are vulnerable when enough hands push against them. What we are witnessing is the triumph of international solidarity, a reminder that oppression does not exist in isolation. It is sustained or challenged by the global community. And here lies the central hook. When ordinary people organize across borders, they can do what states claim is impossible. Consider the wide range of actors who contributed to this breakthrough, from activists who risked their lives at sea, to organizations coordinating supplies, to protesters in cities thousands of miles away demanding governments take a stand. This is the collective energy that made the breach possible. Each protest sign, each petition, each academic resolution may have seemed small on its own, but together they built pressure that the blockade's architects could not entirely resist. Power thrives in silence. Solidarity breaks that silence. It shines light where those in control prefer darkness. When citizens of the world insist that starvation is not a policy, when they expose injustice relentlessly, they change the calculus of governments that had grown comfortable ignoring it. The impact of this solidarity is not only external. For the people of Gaza, knowing that their struggle is recognized, that their suffering has not been forgotten, is itself an act of empowerment. In isolation, despair grows. In connection, hope returns. Imagine living year after year under blockade, told repeatedly that the world has moved on, that no one is coming to your aid. And then imagine seeing ships arrive, sent by those who have never met you, but who refuse to let your struggle vanish. That moment restores faith in humanity, in the possibility of justice. It tells every family in Gaza you are not alone, and that message, perhaps more than the cargo itself, is what breaks the suffocating grip of oppression. The governments that enforced or supported the blockade fear precisely this: the power of solidarity to reshape narratives. They know that once people around the world see Gaza not as a faceless conflict zone, but as a community of families, children, teachers, and workers fighting to survive, the moral ground shifts. No justification, no rhetoric about security or politics can erase the image of ships delivering food to hungry children. The blockade depended on dehumanization. Solidarity restores humanity. And when humanity re-enters the picture, the political cost of supporting such a blockade grows unbearable. We must also recognize the broader lesson here. International solidarity movements are often dismissed as non-avi, ineffective, or symbolic, yet history tells us otherwise. From the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa to the global protests against the Vietnam War, solidarity across borders has consistently altered the trajectory of events. The breakthrough in Gaza joins this tradition. It proves that pressure from below can force cracks in structures built from above. It demonstrates that change does not flow only from state to state, but from people to people, from networks of resistance that defy borders and governments. And here is the deeper truth: solidarity is contagious. When one blockade is broken, when one wall falls, it inspires others to believe that their walls can fall too. The sight of Gaza's ships will echo in places where sanctions starve populations, where sieges enforce submission, where isolation is used as a weapon. The message spreads: Resistance works, solidarity matters, and oppression cannot remain permanent when the world refuses to look away. That is why this moment is dangerous for those who rely on blockades and sieges as tools of power. They know the image of aid ships arriving is not just a local victory, it is a global example. So when we talk about Gaza today, we are not just recounting the arrival of food and medicine, we are recounting the victory of persistence, the proof that even in the face of overwhelming force, international solidarity can prevail. The aid ships represent the courage of people who refuse to surrender to cynicism, who believed that oppression is not destiny, and who acted on that belief until the blockade gave way. That is the story unfolding before our eyes. It is not just Gaza's story. It is a story of what people everywhere can achieve when they choose not to accept silence, but to raise their voices together. What happened in Gaza with the arrival of aid ships is not a story confined to one strip of land. It reverberates outward, raising fundamental questions about how the world uses blockade, sanctions, and economic punishments as weapons of politics. If Gaza's blockade could be pierced, what does that say about the countless other blockades and sanctions still suffocating societies today? That is the uncomfortable question governments must now face. For decades, economic punishment has been dressed up as diplomacy, portrayed as a nonviolent alternative to war. Yet anyone who studies the lived reality of those targeted knows that sanctions and blockades kill without bullets. They starve economies, cripple healthcare systems, and punish civilians far more than leaders. The Gaza breakthrough forces us to reconsider whether these strategies are defensible or whether they are simply modern tools of collective punishment. Think of the pattern. In one country after another, sanctions are imposed with promises of changing political behavior. But what happens instead? Leaders adapt, elites find loopholes, black markets emerge, while ordinary people pay the price. We see it in Cuba, in Iran, in Venezuela, in North Korea. Economic sieges become normalized, accepted as routine parts of international politics, even though their human cost is catastrophic. The aid ships to Gaza break through not just a physical blockade, but this very normalization. They tear away the veneer of legitimacy and expose the cruelty beneath. If the world celebrates the end of Gaza's suffocation, how can it justify continuing suffocation elsewhere? That is the global ripple effect of this moment. The political leaders who defend these measures will insist they are temporary, targeted, or necessary. Yet history shows that blockades and sanctions rarely topple regimes, they harden them. Instead, they weaken societies, creating generations that grow up malnourished, uneducated, and angry. If the goal is peace or stability, economic punishment delivers the opposite. And here lies the hook. When the strategy repeatedly fails, why is it used again and again? The answer is simple but unsettling, because it is less about achieving change than about projecting control. Blockades are not designed to end conflict, they are designed to demonstrate dominance, to remind weaker nations or populations that their survival depends on someone else's permission. Gaza's ships shattered that performance of control, and in doing so, they challenged the entire system that sustains it. Consider also the moral dimension. In an era when the global community claims to uphold human rights, how can it simultaneously endorse policies that starve children and deny medicine to hospitals? The contradiction is glaring. Every sanction and blockade is justified in the language of international law or security, but the lived experience on the ground tells a different story. Lines at food banks, hospitals without electricity, families forced to choose between medicine and food. Gaza's breakthrough forces the world to confront this contradiction head-on. If celebrating Gaza's relief is sincere, it demands more than applause. It demands a rethinking of economic punishment as a legitimate tool. The symbolism of Gaza also matters for movements resisting elsewhere. When communities under blockade or sanctions see Gaza celebrating, they see proof that isolation is not permanent. They see evidence that international solidarity, persistence, and resistance can wear down even the hardest walls. This injects hope into struggles far beyond Palestine. It says to those suffering in silence, the system can be challenged, narratives can be broken, and one day ships of your own may arrive. That spark of hope is dangerous to those who rely on sanctions to control populations, because once hope spreads, the fear that sustains oppression begins to weaken. This breakthrough also raises a sharper question for the global public. If you cheer for Gaza today, will you remain silent tomorrow when another society is strangled? Or will you carry forward the lesson that blockades are not abstract policies, but lived violences? Every aid ship docking in Gaza carries a message written between the lines of its cargo: no blockade is invulnerable, no sanction eternal, and no economic punishment free from moral judgment. That message challenges not only the policymakers who impose such measures, but also the citizens of the world who allow them to continue. So what Gaza represents is more than a single victory. It is a mirror held up to the international system, reflecting back the truth that economic warfare is as brutal as military warfare, only slower, quieter, easier to ignore. And yet, as Gaza shows us, it cannot last forever. Ships will arrive, walls will fall, and the logic of punishment will one day collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The question now is not whether this moment matters. It clearly does. The question is whether the world will learn from it, whether we will see Gaza not as an exception, but as the spark that forces us to question every blockade, every sanction, and every economic weapon used in the name of politics. Gaza's celebration in the wake of the blockade's breach is not a small, isolated event. It is a roar that travels far beyond its borders, a message to the world that even the most entrenched walls can be broken when people refuse to bow to despair. The images of crowds rushing to the shore, waving flags, watching ships that once would have been turned back now arrive with food, medicine, and hope are not merely scenes of local joy. They are global signals. They tell every oppressed people, every sanctioned society, every community locked behind walls, that oppression is not permanent, that no system of domination is immune to collapse. Ask yourself, what is more dangerous to the architects of blockades, a shipment of supplies, or the idea that those blockades are not invincible? The answer is obvious. It is the idea, the symbol, the proof that power can be defied, that inspires and terrifies all at once. For years, Gaza was presented to the world as an example of control. The blockade was supposed to be airtight, unbreakable, a demonstration of absolute dominance. Yet here we are, watching ships break through, proving that what was marketed as permanent was in reality fragile. This fragility is the story. It undermines the illusion of strength upon which oppression depends. Because every empire, every system of control relies not only on military or economic force, but on psychological submission. If people believe a blockade cannot be broken, they adapt to it, normalize it, internalize it. But the moment a breach occurs, the illusion collapses. Suddenly, what was once thought impossible is visible, tangible, real. And that changes everything. The people of Gaza are not just celebrating bread and medicine. They are celebrating the collapse of inevitability, the destruction of the narrative that said, "This is how it must be." When crowds chant, when children dance with food in their hands, when elders weep as medicine enters hospitals that had been starved of supplies, they are participating in something larger than relief. They are reclaiming agency, reclaiming the right to live with dignity rather than merely survive under the thumb of control. And when that reclamation is witnessed by the world, it sends ripples outward that reach far beyond Gaza's borders. Think about those ripples. A farmer in Venezuela struggling under sanctions sees Gaza's joy and wonders if his struggle too can find relief. A family in Iran waiting for medicine that sanctions made scarce sees Gaza's ships and thinks perhaps their blockade can be broken as well. A student in Cuba dreaming of opportunities denied by economic isolation sees Gaza's breakthrough and feels a spark of possibility. This is how moments become movements, by transforming isolated victories into shared symbols of resistance. And Gaza today is that symbol. Those who impose the blockade know this, and that is why they fear the narrative almost more than the aid itself. They fear the celebration, the chants, the images that travel across screens and newspapers worldwide. Because once the idea spreads that walls can fall, other walls tremble. The very foundation of control, built on the perception of invincibility, begins to erode. And when control erodes, movements gain confidence, people regain courage, and governments that rely on blockades as tools of policy are forced onto the defensive. There is also a profound psychological shift that comes with celebration. For years, Gaza's people were conditioned to live with scarcity, to accept deprivation as normal. Celebration reverses that conditioning. It turns scarcity into abundance, despair into joy, invisibility into visibility. And when a people learn to celebrate their own victory, however partial, they begin to imagine bigger victories. They begin to believe in futures beyond blockades, beyond oppression, beyond survival. That belief is powerful because it cannot be bombed, sanctioned, or blockaded. Once ignited, it spreads like fire. This is why Gaza's joy matters, not just for Gaza, but for humanity. It is a reminder that resilience is stronger than repression, that solidarity is stronger than isolation, and that walls, no matter how fortified, are never eternal. The celebration is not naive. It does not erase the challenges that remain, but it does redefine the struggle. It says, "We have tasted victory and we know it can come again." And that message, carried in chants, in songs, in the beating of drums on Gaza's streets, will echo into the hearts of those who fight their own battles across the globe. So when Gaza celebrates, the world should not see it as a distant, localized event. It should see it as a living lesson. Oppression can be broken, resilience can prevail, and the walls that seem most permanent are often the most brittle. The blockade's fall is not only Gaza's triumph, it is a beacon to all who resist, an invitation to believe that their own blockades, political, economic, or psychological, can one day fall as well. So I leave you with this. Do not just applaud the courage of those who broke this blockade. Learn from them, be inspired by them, and understand that every empire that seeks to starve people into submission is writing the story of its own defeat. Gaza celebrates today, but in truth, humanity itself celebrates, because every blockade broken is a victory for us all. Thank you.